My name is Megan Edgar, and I am the General Manager of Maui Nui Marine Resource Council. We're a nonprofit organization focused on clean ocean water, healthy coral reefs, and abundant native fishes. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight. If you guys have been attending our meetings regularly, you know that we're excited about the prospect of putting oysters, caged oysters, in Maui Harbor. And we're excited about that because those guys are amazing filter feeders, and they are excellent at helping clean up the water. And so part of our work that we did to see if it was feasible to put oysters in the harbor is we hired Maui Environmental Consulting to look at the land above the harbor, because as you are well aware, what's going on the land is going to significantly impact what is going on in the water below it. And so they spent a lot of time looking at satellite images, maps, historical documents, and they spent a lot of time walking around on the land, looking at what's going on there. And they came back to us with a really comprehensive list of challenges that are happening that are impacting the water quality negatively in this area. And so we looked at that list, and we have gotten quite excited about doing some work to try to mitigate some of those challenges and help improve the water quality. And we're calling that our vision for Pohakea. And the reason we're calling it that is because right now we are sitting in the Pohakea Ahupua'a, and our goal is to clean up the land in this area so that we can have clean water in the harbor and clean water in Maʻolai Bay, and hopefully have happy oysters that are also helping clean the water some more. And one of the things that we learned when we had Maui Environmental Consulting out on the land is that fire is a huge challenge in the Pohakea Ahupua'a. You guys are probably well aware of that. This side hill over here burns pretty regularly, and it's a concern for a lot of us for a lot of different reasons. So we're very excited this evening for our speaker, because he happens to be an expert on the Wildland Fire. And so Dr. Clay Trauernicht earned his master's degree in botanical sciences from UH Manoa and his PhD in plant sciences from the University of Tasmania. He is a Wildland Fire Specialist at the University of Hawaii Cooperative Extension, and he's a project leader for the Pacific Fire Exchange, which is a group that's part of a national organization called the Fire Science Exchange Network. Dr. Trauernicht's current focus is on improving wildland fire management in Hawaii and in the Pacific, and he's also working with the Pacific Climate Change Cooperative to provide climate science resources throughout the Pacific Island region. So please help me giving a warm round of applause to Dr. Trauernicht.
Thank you guys for thanks for coming. I'm gonna kind of walk you guys through. The talk is about Maui. I tried to make it as specific about Maui as I could, and I'm going to talk a lot about kind of Hawaii more specifically. But before we kind of jump into the specifics about Hawaii, I'm also going to kind of take a bigger picture approach to fire and sort of, I guess, tie it a little bit about my background and experience working with fire, and maybe a little bit how it's shaped my perspective of the problems that you guys are facing here. I mean, I think the timing of this is pretty interesting. Obviously, given the West Maui fires that you guys had in the face of Hurricane Lane, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and also just thinking about how all of the factors that kind of create fire risk on the landscape, and what was sort of within our means of control and what's not within our means of control. And just to start things off, this is where we're at in Hawaii, okay? So we've got a pretty good fire history for the state of Hawaii, believe it or not. This is actually all from like state and territorial records, and then Division of Forestry and stuff, more recently county fire departments. But you can kind of see over the past century or more, this actually runs up to 2018. I just updated this thing about few weeks ago, actually. We've got about a fourfold increase, right? So it's kind of one of those big signs like you are here in this, right? And so that's kind of what I'm going to get into, is like why and how did we go from this kind of little, maybe we got a couple big fire seasons in the past, but now we're sort of running off this cliff, right? So we average about 20,000 acres per year. I guess I'm trying to get around so people aren't looking at through the wall here. About 20,000 acres over the past decade on average each year, but you can see it goes up and down, up and down. So it's really a hard thing to kind of attribute to one thing. Like, is it climate change? Is it, what's driving this change, and why are we out in this kind of huge increase in annual area burned for the state? And so, but before we get there, I kind of want to bring things back a little bit. I mean, fire is, obviously I'm fascinated with it. I wouldn't sort of be in the position I am. I've been at UH for about 5 years, but I've been working on fire for a lot longer than that. And it's a really kind of interesting story to tell in terms of the human connections we have to fire, right? So when we think about fire in this context, right? This is something that we're all familiar with. It's like kind of at the heart of every story. And there's this guy that I really admire. He's a natural historian named Stephen Pine, and he calls people or humans like a fire species, right? We have been using fire before we were Homo sapiens, right? So the evidence for the use of fire with humans goes back to Homo erectus. You're talking about, millions of years we've actually been manipulating and using fire. It's one of the most fundamental tools, and one of the most fundamental things that makes us human, right, is the use of fire. And so a lot of my background is actually dealing with plants. So you guys might have heard I did a master's degree in botany at UH, and so I've worked as a botanist in a lot of parts of the world, but also as an ecologist. And so my interest in fire really came in understanding not only how fire affects ecosystems, but really how people manipulate fire. And so this is kind of a scene that seems sort of like maybe anachronistic, but this is actually where I did my PhD work up in Northern Australia. And this is a friend of mine, Joshua Rostron, who takes care of this land, and one of the ways he does take care of this land is actually by setting fires. And so you can kind of pick yourself up from, where I grew up is in Long Island, New York, right? So very, very, very far away from any of this in suburbia. But to pick yourself up and put yourself down in a place and among people to whom fire is really like nothing, in the sense of it's not a big deal. Like, we burn, we use it, and for them, if they're not using fire and if they come into an area of land that hasn't been burned recently, they think that people are being irresponsible, basically. And so there's this undercurrent theme that kind of goes actually across the globe of people using and living with fire pretty regularly. And so this is kind of the starting point to kind of understand where we're at in Hawaii and how Hawaii is actually different from some other places. Taken out of in a different context, fire can be really unnerving, right? It can be scary. It can be pretty unsettling unless you're this guy trying to make par. But even in this case, right, I first saw this was last year and kind of blown up over the media, and it's like, oh my God, what is going on here? And even in this context, though, this guy, they just look like they're in trouble, but, from the ecosystem perspective, this conifer forest behind me here, a lot of these systems actually depend on fire, right? So fire is part of natural systems in a lot of places. But where we have kind of diverged is kind of how we are not paying attention to it. And the simple fact is, if you start mismanaging fire, it has really sort of negative consequences. This is another context to kind of think about. This is actually a helicopter in this corner for scale. I could kind of try to point it out on this one. This is actually a fire ripping up the side of Mount Ka'ala on Oahu. This is the first wildland fire my career at UH that I got to go pull off the side of the road and watch, and it was like, oh my God, like, what are we dealing with here, right? And having worked as a botanist for so long in Hawaii and kind of the understanding of how these ecosystems work and respond to fire, and ultimately don't really respond to fire well, this is also unnerving for lots of reasons, right? So again, it's kind of all about the context. Here's my golf shot. This is the West Side fires that happened about 3 weeks before the West Side fires here. These are 5,000 acres burned on the Waianae, Makaha, Kuakea'au, Lualua valleys. We had 4 valleys on fire at one time, the beginning of August. And so again, it's context. And I love this picture too, because the only thing that didn't burn in Makaha was the freaking golf course, right? So if you think about the causes, and we're going to get into this, like what's driving these changes, we have choice in the matter, right? We could change landscapes to make them less likely to burn. A golf course is kind of an extreme example of this, but yeah, it was amazing to be in this valley, and literally the only thing that hadn't burnt from the coastline up to the forest edge was the golf course. And this was, so this was just this past August, right before you guys had your big fires with Lane. And so the idea, and I think that one of the central themes in fire science kind of across the globe right now is that we need to relearn how to live with fire. This is just a sort of snippets. I kind of pulled this off, I think, Twitter last year. But just all of these examples again and again. Feds are running out of money to fight the massive Oregon wildfires. Smoke from the west sweeping across the country, affecting health outcomes for people across the whole continent, even into Europe. People dying from this, right? I mean, this is like, these consequences again and again are emerging, and it's kind of becoming obvious that we're not really handling this issue very well. The reason we need to coexist and learn how to coexist with fire is gonna become pretty apparent in this little video. So this is cool. This idea of pyrogeography is something that my supervisor has been trying to push. It sounds really kind of pretentious actually a little bit, but this idea that we can actually now predict what's driving fire and patterns of fire across the globe. And our ability to do this now is unprecedented because we have really neat satellites that we can play with. And so what I'm going to show you now is a time series or time lapse over the course of about a year from this MODIS satellite imagery. And it's going to show green ups of the vegetation and brown downs and then active fire detection. So all these little red dots you see are actually active fire detections happening. So this is Australia. That picture was taken up there, and you can see we're going to be cycling from wet season, the green, back to dry season. And in the minute you sort of hit that dry season, the start of the dry season, you can see that whole landscape up in northern Australia, which is this tropical grassland savanna, kind of light up with fire. You get similar patterns sort of with summer, winter patterns kind of in the northern hemisphere. Down south, if you pay attention, dry season hits Southeast Asia, the whole landscape lights up with fire. And same in northern India. Most of these are agricultural burning for pasture and clearing out agricultural fields. Africa is actually known as the fire continent, and what we're seeing here is kind of the alternating wet-dry seasons over the hemispheres, or across the equator rather, and you get, the minute the dry season sets in, the whole landscape is lighting up, and the majority of these are being set intentionally by people. So again, improving pasture quality, clearing land for agriculture. The uses of fire are kind of amazing, how many different uses there are and applications. And a lot in these rural settings. Similar pattern happens in South America, so you kind of get the Brazilian Cerrado, this savanna in the south, and then the Grand Savanna up north. It's kind of flip-flopping wet, dry seasons. And the minute these things dry out, the whole landscape is essentially lighting up. Unfortunately, this doesn't cover North America into the summer, but you can kind of see these springtime fires. And what is the big season for burning down in the southeast. A lot of that is actually prescribed by fire. So people are taking a proactive step, burning intentionally in conditions that they can understand when fire is going to be dangerous or not dangerous in order to prevent these sort of catastrophic or uncontrolled fires afterwards. And so the whole point of this is not only to show what we can do with really cool satellite imagery, but also just to establish the fact that fire's not going to go away. This is not a question of suppression. We're not going to put all of these things out, right? We have to learn how to deal with it and live with it, even in Hawaii. And actually, this was I threw this in there because I was afraid the video might not work. But this is actually a paper that I worked on for part of my PhD, where I actually just dug into the literature and found any example I could of people using fire as a tool. And it goes across the world. Every continent you can think of, there's examples, even Hawaii, of people burning, people using fire for specific purposes. And so this trend emerges again and again everywhere you go. It's been a problem that we've been dealing with basically for our whole existence. And this is my one slide for fire science. So we can kind of understand how this works. This is a great figure. It looks a little complicated here, but if you start thinking about fire on kind of two different scales, so you can have time, right, from seconds out to decades, and then this axis is from spatial scales, like really close, meters, right, up to like hundreds of kilometers. And what we can kind of frame the three different components of fire science. You have this flame component. This is the sort of thing, this is like fluid dynamics physicists work on this kind of stuff. So like in structure fires, like what actually causes the chemical reactions and drives fire behavior like of a flame. You can talk about wildfire, and so this is kind of the realm of suppression, and a lot of wildland fire science focuses on this, predicting where and how a fire is actually going to move over the landscape. So over the course of days, right, and maybe over the course of square miles, for example. And then you get up into this realm called fire regimes, and this is really the idea of pyrogeography, is how do elements of climate, the ignition sources, and vegetation type maintain these patterns of fire over time. So like when and where, how big are the fires happening, and you can really start understanding then there's these feedbacks, right? So if vegetation burns, it might alter the structure of that vegetation, influencing how it will burn in the future. And so all of these things are kind of tied together, but what we're really going to be talking to understand fire is up in this realm, this idea of fire regimes, these recurring patterns over time. This is Guinea grass fire in central Oahu from 2013, experimental fire that we actually set in cooperation with some folks on the mainland, and actually it went out of prescription though, as a safe way to say it went out of control. It was caned at the road though, they got it. But the reason that, I could dwell on like this side of it, but like the science part for hours and hours and bore you to tears, but there's a reason we study this is ultimately because the rest of people really care when a fire is burning. You're concerned about two things, right? The threat that it poses to the resources you value, and then the effect that it has on those resources. And so I know we're in kind of the coral reef community here. One thing that distinguishes Hawaii and other Pacific islands is the fact that every time we get a fire, you're a stone throw away from coral reef systems, right? And this is a problem that they don't have on the mainland, and this is something when we talk with Western state foresters, for example, we're like constantly hammering them. That's like this connection to the reef is huge here, and it's not something that a state forester in Nevada is thinking about at all. So fire threat, fire effects. This is why these processes become so important to understand. They also help us map out like what we can do, right? So we can look at what's driving fire behavior, but also the repeated fires in terms of a fire regime. And we can really only do two things here. We can target ignitions, and that's really about knowing the community and how these fires are starting. And the only thing we have really direct control over is the vegetation. And I'll come back to this, but essentially, how vegetation, topography, and whether all these factors in the landscape are going to kind of drive the tendency for these places to burn again and again, as we see kind of across the state. So this slide is here to remind me to tell you that fire has been part of Hawaii's landscape since the islands emerged out of the ocean, right? Because we've had volcanic ignition source. Anywhere there's an active volcano, you have the potential for brush fires. There was plenty of brush fires happening on the most recent flow of Kilauea. It was hard to see it because you had all the sulfur plume, but anywhere where there's active flows, you're gonna have brush fires, but things have changed. The first kind of wake-up call that things aren't the way that they might have been in the past was actually a long time ago in 1901. We had this fire on the Hamakua coast that burned for 3 months, and it burned about 30,000 acres, estimated 30,000 acres. And I love telling this story, especially people from the mainland, because there's this very famous fire, I think it was 1907 or 1908 that happened. It burned through Montana, Wyoming, and a little bit of Idaho, I think, called the Big Burn. And this was actually what spurred the establishment of the U.S. Forest Service. So the U.S. Forest Service was the Bureau of Forestry. Before that, they were about on the chopping block. These huge fires happened out west, and it basically gave them cause to exist, right? We had this 7 years beforehand on the Hamakua coast. The recently established Commission of Agriculture and Forestry, this was territorial government at the time, sort of freaked out, like what the heck is going on over here? They brought some people in from the US Bureau of Forestry, and what I love this quote, this is from these original reports, which you can find this online. They knew the same thing that we were talking about today. The whole problem is conserving the water supply, which depends on the preservation of the existing forests and restocking of some of the denuded slopes. So in response to this 1901 fire, you have a forest warden program start, which would become the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. You have the first forest reserve established on the Big Island, the Hamakua Forest Reserve. And so these guys, a century ago, saw the value of these resources at Malka, at least. They probably weren't making the connections to the reef quite yet. But it's sort of the same issue. That's why it's kind of funny that we're still talking about the same thing 100 plus years later. But obviously, things have changed. So when we see a fire like this, we know that this is like a bit of out of place and out of context, right? So fires are happening with more frequency than they had, and certainly when it was just volcanic ignitions. And they're having some very serious ecological effects, both Mauka and Makai. When native forests burn here, they take a very long time for any of these species to recover, and they typically do not recover to what they were. So you'll get some species coming back. For example, acacia koa loves fire. It'll come back gangbusters if it's in the seed bank. Uluhe, on the other hand, this is a fire Kipapa, so up in the Ko'olau Mountains, wet forest on Oahu. We're still monitoring this site. This was 2015. And so we're seeing lots of koa and some natives coming back, but also lots of weeds. So every time you get a fire here, the race starts, and it's a competition between these weedy grasses in particular and the native stuff. And our native species essentially can't really compete in these post-fire environments. It affects our communities, right? So this was a fire in 2012 that burnt through the back of Waianae Valley. And torched the Ka'ala Farm, which is a cultural learning center back there. The only thing that didn't burn in this fire was the lo'i. And interestingly enough, in this example, what they're doing now in cooperation with DOFA is they're actually diverting the water source from here to actually reestablish the lo'i behind the farm as a fire break, which guarantee the only place in the world that that's happening. Right, and they lost their hale, so they're still rebuilding from this fire. You can go back there and you see all these dead hale koa still. It was pretty scary and pretty intense. And of course the reef connection. And so I have to tell everyone, don't look at the waves here. You're looking at that, and it actually doesn't show so well here. You're looking at that big reef, that slick, right, the sediment loading behind Honolulu there. And so what we're really concerned about is in this post-fire environment, the biggest protector of soil is vegetative cover, right? So the minute you lose all the vegetation, it all gets consumed by the fire, all of that soil is exposed. There's really only one study and across the whole Pacific, was it in Guam, and they looked at the effect of grass fires on erosion, and you were getting these 2 to 4-fold increases in erosion from grasslands. And those effects were like lasting up to 18 months in some cases, where you're still getting increased erosion post-fire. So even we see these grasslands recover so quickly post-fire, right, that things green up so quickly, it's still having a pretty big impact. Unfortunately, we don't really know how much of an impact, like how much worse are these fires making all that sediment loading on our reefs. But we know that it is having an effect. And of course, you guys here have kind of seen the worst of it from the sense of home loss, right? So these fires are getting us into the territory where now we're thinking about what are the lessons being learned in California and other places where we actually have to deal with not only the cost of loss and property loss, but literally like the trauma that affects these communities for years and years after these events. And how do we cope with this in the aftermath of these fires? And we'll come back. I have some slides about Lane and stuff. We can come back and talk about this. So we're back here. We're out in this. We can kind of understand what the impacts are, what the sort of, why it's an important thing to be worried about. I want to kind of get in a little bit more specifics about what's driving this. And actually, this is going to be for you guys. But so back to this idea of fire regimes, you have climate, ignitions, and vegetation. In the Pacific, what makes the Pacific so special, actually, is that it's almost all people. So we're seeing these changes across all of these things, people, climate, and vegetation. And this is really what's happening here. So this will date you if you get this guy. I show this to the students at UH, and they're just like, anyway. So people, right? Almost all of our fires are human caused. So be it power lines, which I'm sure people are gonna have questions about, or arson, accidental fires. We were talking about this before the talk. I think I've got about 12,000, actually now about 17,000 ignition point records. So these are like records from the county fire departments and DOFA. And I think all of those records, there's about 300 or so that actually have cause attributed to it. So we're kind of in the dark in terms of, what exactly is causing these things, but we know they can all be attributed to people, and I'll get into that as well. Vegetation has been changing, so this idea of this expansion of grasslands and savannas, we'll talk about that too, because I think Maui, I don't know whether to call you guys sort of at the forefront of it or at the tail end, but we'll talk about that. And then of course, climate. And we all know this sort of green up, brown down cycle. You guys are watching it happen in your backyards. It gets very much exacerbated by El Nino, and we're sort of still on the fence this year whether or not it's going to be a real El Nino. But when we do get El Ninos, we get this sort of 1-2 punch of a wetter than average summer followed by a really dry winter, and that's when we see our really big fire years. And that's actually the same pattern across the Pacific Islands. So this idea of fire is a cultural phenomenon on islands. So we know this because of lightning. So I talked about volcanic ignitions. Really the only primary source other than volcanoes is lightning. And lightning density is just incredibly low. So we don't really get lots of lightning strikes on islands. And it's because the landmass can't generate the heat that drives those big cumulus clouds that turn into thunderheads. And so it's kind of just a cool function of physics and landmass and things. But so we know what makes islands so special is that we know that the minute people showed up, just like everywhere else they've arrived, they've pretty much flipped that switch. So they're burning and they're using fire for all kinds of reasons. And so that's what makes studying fire in the Pacific so interesting, is that we know that it came with people. People brought it here. And so when we talk about human migration, this is also technically like a migration of fire, right, throughout the region as well. This has been the most well-studied in New Zealand. So this is charcoal quantity, essentially, in these soil sediment cores that they do. And so we know that in the Maori settled New Zealand about 800 years ago. And so we just see this huge jump in charcoal signatures through these sediment layers. So it's the evidence, right, that charcoal increases when you get people, so that they're burning. And they've done some really interesting reconstructions of what forest cover would have been like prior to people. And so the minute the Maori show up, they're using fire, they're altering the landscape, and you actually get this large-scale changes in vegetation. And I have slides from other islands. You can look at the same outcome, essentially, across the Pacific. But it's still a cultural phenomenon in the sense that it's tied back to people. And the best evidence for this is just looking at total ignitions, right? So this is from the complete data set that I had. I think at the time I did this was 2005, so about 6 years. Total ignitions versus human population per island, and it's just this perfect relationship, right? So poor us over on Oahu, we're looking at like 500 to 600 ignitions per year. So wildfire ignitions, these are brush fire starts. Fortunately, on all the islands, the vast majority of these are small. So county fire department is really good at their job, and they come in and they put most of these fires out. It's these few, maybe 10 to 5% that turn into these big fires that have the big impacts, like burning up the side of Maui, for example. We can also take this data spatially and map it to, so this is ignition density. So it's basically a gradient of the number of ignitions per square mile per year. And it just maps out to the most inhabited areas. It's the same pattern on all islands, except more ignitions on Oahu than anywhere else. But it's pretty much anywhere you have people, you have high densities of ignition. So we know where the ignitions are happening. Again, we don't know exactly what's causing them all. But it's a problem with us, pretty much. And then the vegetation. And so we're also dealing with, it's just a consequence of the environment around us. So fuel, if you're a fire scientist, plants, if you're a botanist, or probably most normal people, we have a problem with native grasses, or with non-native grasses kind of spreading and have expanded across the state. All of these grasses, almost all of them are from Africa. They all love fire. They burn the tops off. They wouldn't even know it hit them. They're resprouting. You've seen it on those mountainsides here. They're resprouting within days. And these non-native grasslands and shrubland mixed ecosystems cover 25% of state land area. I actually looked this up this morning. It's 36% of Maui County. So that's about, I want to say about 250,000 acres is this non-native grassland and shrubland. So just the scale, it's just to get you a sense of scale of this problem, 1 million acres statewide, these non-native ecosystems. I mean, again, I keep talking about this. I worked as a botanist on Kauai for years. I was always up in these green areas at the top of the mountain looking for cool native plants. I had no idea that this was the case, like the relative extent of these vegetation types. And these non-native grasslands and shrublands account for 85% of the area burned. So the vast majority of our fires are just burning these grasslands. that means 85% of that area burned isn't really having a big impact on native ecosystems, but it is exposing soil to increased erosion. It's endangering homes and threatening other resources and infrastructure. And then I will add, to that 15% of forest type that burns, we are having some pretty significant impact. The forests don't tend to recover after these fires. It's a lot of carbon lost, emitted to the atmosphere that we don't recover in the aftermath of these fires. And it kind of brings me back, kind of combining people and vegetation is like, why the heck do we have so much of this grassland? My PhD supervisor has this paper called The Wilderness Effect. And in there, he's talking about these areas in northern Australia that are no longer being burned by the Aboriginal families because they've sort of moved off the land. And you just see all this degradation happening. So fires kind of go out of control. For us, the wilderness effect that we're kind of experiencing now is this decline. So this is that area burn figure. Actually, this one I didn't update. This only goes to 2012. And you just line this up with agricultural production, right? So we've got pasture land and active pasture, and then the extent of land in total crops, and kind of split out between sugarcane and pineapple. And you can just see that this big jump in fire really coincides with huge declines in agricultural production. So that footprint of agriculture on the land has declined about 60%. So there's 60%, in other words, less land under production across the state right now. And this is what we get left with, right? We've got these vast, vast swaths of grassland and shrublands that are unmanaged, either invaded kind of crap like fountain grass on the Big Island. This is actually could be forage. This is in Waianae. This is mostly guinea grass, maybe a little buffalo grass, but it's not being grazed, right? So this is just not active anymore. And it's just posing these fire risks. And then you guys know here, between these lowland areas, central Maui, west Maui, all around Lanai, all these areas that are no longer actively farmed or grazed, they just turn into fuels that are ready to burn. And this is kind of, the point here is to make that, especially when kind of defending the firefighters, is that we're kind of in this new era. It's like this post-plantation era. They have the burden that's now placed on the shoulders of firefighters is really unprecedented. We have not seen anything like this throughout the history of that, at least we can kind of trace back in Hawaii. And this is the fire history for Maui. So I actually, I was joking, I actually was working on this last night because we had a little set of like 10 years of fires, and we finally updated it through 2018, and I didn't have it together until Monday. And so I was like up last night trying to like put this all together to show you guys. But essentially across the whole county, you're getting these giant fires. So you get this belt, and there's probably 3 or 4 fires stacked in Maalaea. There's a few fires stacked in Kahiki Nui, for example. But this is the outcome, right? This is the consequence of not doing anything on these landscapes. And interestingly enough, we have these conversations, especially with the folks doing the work up Mauka, and you're finally kind of looking down and trying to wrap your head around what the heck do we do with this. And so it's really cool to talk to people who are kind of working Makai, looking back up. So we're trying to figure out how do we meet in the middle, right? Because that's where the problem is. It's that zone in the middle. And it's exactly what made us so vulnerable to this incident, right? All of that unmanaged fuels, all of that unused land. The last thing I expected on Friday was to wake up and see that there's a giant fire burning on West Maui. And interestingly enough, a friend of mine who works at the National Weather Service had contacted me the storm before this. Hector, I think, was the one right before this, was approaching Oahu, the state, when we had our big fires on the west side there. And he was freaking out because he's actually watching the weather stations across the state, and he's watching the relative humidity drop. So think about this, a hurricane is coming at us, and meanwhile, all across these weather stations, relative humidity, in other words, the moisture in the air, which then affects the moisture in the plants and causes them to burn, allows them to burn, is dropping as this storm's approaching. And we're just like, what the heck is going on? And he's like, well, it's kind of makes sense because you've got this crazy low pressure system. It's literally just sucking moisture towards it. And it's just pulling all of that moist air away from the land towards the storm. And when we actually look at the data from Kahului Airport, so here we've got a few things. This is kind of complicated, but the distance from lane's eye to the weather station, right? So as it's getting close, and then a time series. So we've got, August 21st up to the day with the fire started. This purple is kind of the big run that it made in the middle of the night, essentially, and then till the point that it was actually contained. And I've got wind speed anomaly, which is essentially the difference between the wind conditions and average wind conditions. Relative humidity anomaly, so the difference between actual or average relative humidity and the conditions during the storm, and temperature. And so what you see as the storm approaches, what kind of makes sense, right? Wind jumps up, right? So first kind of red flag when it comes to firefighting. Heavy high winds, incredibly dangerous conditions, incredibly difficult, very, very fast moving fires, especially in grasslands. But this was the weird one, right? So you get this little bump in relative humidity and then it crashes. And again, what we're thinking here, and I'm actually working with a meteorologist at UH who specializes in hurricanes, is that as these hurricanes are approaching the state, it's drying out the air. And so not only were these guys coping with wind, but they were coping with incredibly increased fire danger just due to this humidity effect. And so it literally was worst case scenario, right? It's at night. You can't fly helicopters in this wind. You can't really see what's going on. And I know a lot of attention is getting paid towards the possibility of it being MECO, right? Like from the power lines. And I think it's obviously way more critical to be thinking about this. And given the situation in California, I don't know if a lot of you guys have heard this, but just last week, Pacific Gas and Electric filed for bankruptcy because they were held liable for the fires in California from last year. And so we need to be thinking about this as an ignition source, but it's not a counter argument, but I think it's important to also realize that how the changes in the landscape around us have sort of set us up for one of these incidents. They've increased. We're just so incredibly vulnerable for one of these that if it wasn't the power line, if it was kids playing with matches, or it was just someone, an accidental ignition, it could have been started by anything, okay? Like we are primed for a disaster that we saw in West Maui to happen kind of at any time. So I think it's just important to sort of understand the full context of what's going on and what's making us sort of vulnerable to these. Climate change, this is sort of one that a lot of my colleagues who kind of helped create this position, the position I have, were so stoked. They're like, we're going to show that climate is changing and that it's increasing fire. It's really tricky in the tropics. So on the mainland, we know that climate change is having an effect because we're basically seeing spring and fall kind of disappear, right? So you get a longer summertime, which is the fire season. So it's really easy to show it's affecting fire currents and fire severity. In the tropics, it's a lot harder because we can get fire conditions any time of year, right? So if we get a sort of unseasonal drought, we can have high fire risk in the middle of winter. But it does kind of follow some patterns that we can attribute to this. And so one of those theories that is linking water availability, essentially rainfall, to fire is that you get a sweet spot for fire. And you can kind of understand if it's too wet, right? So we don't see lots of fires at the top of the mountain here. But on the other hand, it's also limited by dry conditions, and it's effectively because there's nothing to burn, right? So you don't get fires in a desert too often because there's just no vegetation, there's no fuel to burn. And actually, you can look at this and model this. And so this was like a proof of concept paper that I just published looking at how can we use climate and sort of historical fires to see what the influence of rainfall and temperature are on current fire risks. This is literally, you can look at this as fire return time. And so these red areas is where we'd be expecting to see fires like every 15 years kind of going up. So this is Hamakua Coast, the northwest side of the Big Island. So biggest rainfall gradient in the state. So kind of a really interesting landscape to look at. And what we do know from the best climate projections we have is that rainfall band essentially is going to shift Malca, right? So you're going to see drying along the coast, and especially on the leeward sides of all the islands, it's going to sort of shift mean rainfall up to upper elevations. And by kind of modeling how this affects fire probability now, we can push things out into the future and kind of understand how fire risk is going to literally shift under our feet. And so this is what the kind of outcomes that we're looking at And this is mid-century, right? So I think another thing to kind of take in mind is like when we think about climate change and these effects that are coming our way, this is decades out, a couple decades out, right? We're not talking end of century 2100. This is 2050. It's going to have a significant effect on where fire risk is highest. Interestingly, you're actually getting lower risk down near residential areas along the coast, but this has pretty significant consequences, especially for protecting watersheds and all these fire-sensitive species that we're worried about. So kind of trying to wrap up. What can we manage, right? So I talked about this briefly at the beginning, looking at these triangles, fire triangles that we like to use in fire science. There's only really two things that we can tackle here. You can get at ignitions kind of indirectly, and so I mentioned we had about 300 records that we have actual causes attributed to, and so maybe I think it's about 75% of those are accidental, right? So if you educate the public, if you teach everyone when and when not to do welding and when not to use machinery, that means 75% of those fires were preventable, right? So that is a big piece, public education and outreach. The other part of this, and I know most of the nonprofits and the watershed partnerships are all branching into this, is really public outreach, like educating the public on what's at stake, especially Malcolm Mackay, like how do these resources get impacted? And that's kind of the idea, is if you get people to have a connection to this place, maybe we can actually also chip away at the arson cases, because that is also a problem here in Hawaii. And so that's a little bit of indirect actions we can take. The really thing we can only do directly is vegetation. We can actually change vegetation. We can make it less flammable. And we actually have a lot of good examples, or at least ideas about how to do this. I think there's not a ton of evidence of these programs or projects actually being implemented. I mean, ideally, from my perspective, we want to do some stuff and then actually burn it and see what happens. And that's kind of hard to do. Hard to get permission to do that stuff, especially after that fire in 2013 I was telling you about. So, yeah, I don't know if we're going to get permission to do prescribed burning. But having said that, Maui County Fire Department does prescribed burns. They do it for fuels mitigation and also training. So there are opportunities to maybe test some of these ideas. But there's an idea floating at the national level right now called the Cohesive Strategy for Wildland Fire Management. And this is this idea that there's all these moving pieces, there's all these agencies and interests, and from communities up to forestry agency, up to the nonprofit and conservation groups that realize what's at stake. They want to see that our relationship and sort of the way that fire is managed change. And the idea is that how do we kind of get consensus and sort of get, again, collective action moving towards some common goals? And the way that they are framing this at the national level is this idea of fire resilient landscapes. So these would be landscapes that can cope with fire better. Maybe for us in Hawaii, it's decreasing the fire risk, making them less flammable. In Volcanoes National Park, for example, they're actually experimenting where they're only doing restoration in certain areas with native plants that they know will recover after fire, because they're anticipating it's going to burn again. So we want native species that will actually come back, and we don't have to do as much weed management. And then the idea of fire adapted communities. And this is already happening on Maui. Is it 3? There's 3 Firewise communities. I think that's might be my next slide. Oh, no. I'll get to the Firewise communities. Fire resilient landscapes. This was like a study we did for DOFA at Puuawa, so one of the big forest reserves on the west coast. This is actually, those red marks are historical fires on the Big Island. So this is like the most fire-prone landscape in the state. They get giant fires, 25,000, 40,000 acres in the past. And so this is like current land cover. And really, roughly speaking, you've got green is forest, and then the light green there is all grassland. And so the managers there wanted to know, like, can we show what a scenario would be if we got it from this down to here? If we did full-scale restoration across this watershed, this would cost, estimated, by the way, about $60 million to do this. So it's maybe up high in the sky kind of dream. But what we were able to do is actually then show, well, how does this affect fire risk and moving into the future, right? So we know we're not going to do this overnight, but let's say a 20, 30-year plan to reforest this watershed. How is fire risk going to change in the future? And because we can model what the heck it's going to look like with future conditions, we can compare. This is if you do nothing versus if you actually do this full-scale restoration. And you can make these really significant impacts on the risk of fire in the future by altering the vegetation and changing that landscape. So it's not exactly like what to do, but definitely questions like how to do that. Like, how do you actually get buy-in? How do you get financing together to do something like that? And then I work closely, you guys might be familiar with this, CREW, Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, nonprofit based on the Big Island over in Waimea. And so they've been really at the forefront of community outreach, organizing communities to become Firewise. And so we've got 3 communities on Maui, a bunch more on Big Island that they're organizing community boards essentially and trying to get all the households in those communities to buy into these projects. So pool money together to do community projects, get people educated on how to reduce risk around their own homes. So a lot of stuff going on with them, community workshops, fuels management, mapping, all these kinds of projects they've got going on. We've also worked with all the state, county agencies, federal agencies as well to just ramp up public outreach, right? So like, can we get a unified message? Can we kind of organize? And we put some fact sheets together and they do these press releases every year. I think it's now just called Hawaii Lookout, Wildfire Lookout. We pull in the drought sort of depends. If we're in a big drought, maybe we'll put that back in there. But again, trying to just get the word out with the chance of maybe you'll increase homeowner preparedness, essentially, what this is about. And then on my side of the thing, the coin here is trying to get better science and trying to ensure that all of these stages, be it from homeowner actions to landscape scale actions, reforestation, things like that, is founded in science. So if we have research that's pertinent or done in Hawaii, that's great, but odds are we don't. So we're looking elsewhere too to find out what we can learn. And so we've got funding from the Joint Fire Science Program, which is this national program, to the Pacific Fire Exchange. And so we've got 15 of these exchanges across the country. And we're all trying to basically link managers and the public with the best available science. But not just to put the science out there, but honestly, the most important part of that is to say, what are your needs? Like, what are the things you need to know so that we can get the science to address those concerns? So it's kind of this two-way feedback between there. And we have this platform online where we kind of post these informational, so we have technical guides and fact sheets. We do webinars. We organize field trips to different places. We did one in 2016 after the Kahiki Nui fire where we brought up DHHL, some county council members, for example, and got out there and just to get on the land and like, what were the challenges? Like, what did the firefighters have to deal with? How could things be put in place next time that would make their job easier? What are the options for the community to kind of keep risk down in the meantime? And like I said, this is happening all across the country. And so it's really cool because we get to learn from each other too. So we all get together once a year and we're like trying to share ideas and different activities and just strategies, like how to get the word out, how to engage more people. And I like to show this slide because you try to end on a positive note, but I also want to end in reality. Like if anyone's seen a head fire ripping through guinea grass, this is not an easy thing to tackle, right? This is serious, serious stuff. The mainland fire guys think about grass fires and they're thinking about like buffalo grass or cheatgrass. It moves fast and it's dangerous, but like this is heavy duty conditions that we're trying to tackle here. I like to show this also to my friends and colleagues who want to do like green fire breaks and plant trees. Like, we need to use multiple strategies, like everything that's sort of on the table, from using ungulates, like grazing, to revegetating, to weed whacking, whatever we can kind of come up with. It's going to take kind of all of it. Because, yeah, we all get in over our heads, speaking of a little bit gnarly conditions. And so, yeah, with that, I guess I pass it to questions. I think I'm kind of done. So thank you guys for sticking out with me.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. Learned a lot. All right, thanks you guys for being here tonight. We can't do what we do without your support, so thank you for being here. If any of you are interested in becoming a MNMRC member, we do have memberships available. If you join us, you get a really cool M&MRC tote bag and a sticker, or you can choose to get a Reef safe sunscreen packet, which is also a pretty cool little gift that we provide with a membership. So if you want to become a member, you can stop by our table there. We also have memberships available online. You can go to our website, mauireefs.org, and you can sign up there. But thank you all very much for coming.